Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the program. This summer in Memphis and across the country, we saw daily protests and heard cries for police reform on a scale never before witnessed in our lifetimes. But calls for reform police are hardly new, nationally or here in Memphis. I think a quick overview of that history is instructive to our conversation tonight. The Memphis Police Department has a long and proud history as a law enforcement agency. It was founded in 1827, shortly after the founding of the city. MPD was decimated by the yellow fever epidemics and rebuilt in the 20th century as Memphis grew in prominence in the South. The men and women of the department have been responsible for some incredible innovation in recent decades. This includes the implementation of data-driven policing and the formation of the Crisis Intervention Team, which is recognized as a model in training to de-escalate crises with unstable and mentally ill individuals. We must remember too that policing can be a dangerous job. 75 of MPD's officers have been killed in the line of duty over the years. At the same time, there's been a strong, decades-long undercurrent of violence and corruption at MPD. MPD was a recruiting ground for the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and its reputation for open brutality was well known through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Police often talked about doling out a John Gaston turban. That's a reference to bandaging of an arrestee's head at the old city-run John Gaston Public Hospital. It was so prevalent a term that it remained in the police parlance until recent years. In an effort to lessen brutality, the city hired its first handful of African-American officers in 1948. Still, serious abuse came. There was a large outcry for a citizen review board in 1971 following the police beating death of Elton Hayes, a teenager. The police shooting death of another Memphis teen, Eric Garner, led to the landmark 1985 US Supreme Court decision that ruled that police cannot shoot a fleeing suspect unless they pose a significant risk of death or injury to others or the police. The Citizen Review Board was finally organized under Mayor Willie Harrington in 1992, but it became inactive for several years. And even now, it's in its reorganization, the Civilian Law Enforcement Review Board, or CLRB, is considered by many to be toothless and rather ineffective, lacking any real power. Following the death of George Floyd in May in Minneapolis, police reform gained new traction in Memphis. In what seemed a watershed moment, Mayor Jim Strickland vowed to fix, quote, the problem of how police deal with Black people, unquote. He since appointed an advisory committee on reimagining police, and the mayor said he wants more implicit bias training and would consider handing over some of the first responder duties that police handle to mental health professionals. Still, history, it really is hard to change. I mean, history shows us that change doesn't come easy. As a journalist, I can tell you that the city has made gaining access to MPD's excessive force records quite challenging. Here at the Institute for Public Service Reporting, we found, after much digging, that MPD treats severe excessive force as mere violation of policy. They don't refer these cases to prosecutors for criminal charges. And these aren't cases that we've seen that the officers getting a bit too physical when they're arresting a subject. Many of these cases appear to be acts of torture. Officers beating handcuffed prisoners. There was a case in 2019 of a mentally ill man who was handcuffed and sprayed in the face with a chemical irritant. And another case in 2016 of a man handcuffed and repeatedly electrostunned with a taser. So as a result of our reporting, the district attorney, Amy Wyrick, has asked MPD to start referring all confirmed cases of excessive force to her office, and MPD is weighing that proposal. In fairness, I'd like to point out that Director Rollins was invited to speak tonight, but he declined. So now with that said, let's move on to our discussion. And panel, the first thing I'd like to ask everyone is this: what does reimagining police mean to you? And if you can, identify a couple issues that need to be addressed to effectively reform policing. And in the interest of time, we're going to ask that you limit your answers to 1 or 2 minutes. And I think Shahidah Jones, could you start us off, please?
I had a feeling you're going to start with me. So reimagining policing to me really means reimagining public safety. The majority of the money that we spend for public safety goes to policing in jails and prison. I think it requires that we think about public safety as more than just police. And I think that it requires that we think about other interventions, alternative models, and ways, non-punitive ways of dealing with what are some of our biggest problems. Drug abuse, addiction, domestic violence are some of the things that we see over and over and over again. And I think it has been proven that actual arrest and policing don't actually get to the root of that, solve that, and those are some of the biggest also repeat offenders, right? And so we're now seeing folks talk about drug addiction as a disease. We're now seeing folks talk about different ways to identify and support both the victim and the perpetrator when we start talking about domestic violence. And I think lastly, I think it's time to start spending those dollars elsewhere into community supports that help reduce and actually get to the root of why people participate in crime. As it comes to policing, for me, that means scaling it back, scaling down the number of policings and amount of dollars that we have. And so that's really what I think about when I think about reimagining policing and reimagining public safety.
Okay, very good. Sergeant Richard McKinney, could you take a whack at this too?
Well, when you talk about reimaging policing, I think that Ms. Jones was spot on with a lot of her things when you're talking about educating people on getting to the root of the problem with drug usage, mental health, domestic violence, those things. As an officer, I will have to say that a lot of that will revert to training and education, not just for officers, but for the general public as well. Funding is very important in all aspects and realms of it, meaning we have to have the sources and tools in order to get those things done.
Very good. Myesha Braden.
Thank you, Mark. I agree with what's been said, but I would add a slightly different take on things. For me, reimagining policing means that the public begins to understand that policing is a reflection of political decisions, political determinations, and political will. I use the example of a grocery store. If you are upset with the price of milk, having an argument with the clerk that is ringing up your milk is not effective. And in many cases, police officers are the clerk. A city council, a mayor, a state legislature has made a decision about what the price of milk is. They've made a decision about what is going to be considered to be illegal behavior, and they've made a decision about what the penalties for that behavior should be, and they've made a decision about what the focus and intensity of enforcement of that particular thing is going to be. All of those decisions are outside of the hands of police officers. They are simply ringing up your order. So for me, reimagining policing means that people begin to understand that if they want to change policing, if they want policing in their community to occur in a different way, then they've got to engage and view policing as a political decision. And they've got to start to pay attention to the people who are making those political decisions rather than simply stopping at the low-hanging fruit, which in many cases is the officer on the street.
Okay, thank you. Linda Williams.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. Reimagining law enforcement or public safety, it's an extension of the modeling of 21st century policing, where we look at we assess, address, and correct actions within law enforcement. But most important is that collaborative relationship between the community, between law enforcement and the communities that we serve. We're looking at how we can better serve with collaborative partnership with other social agencies, but most importantly, to have an accountability of the men and women that serve in law enforcement, that we can develop a trust and a mutual respect between the community and likewise them to law enforcement.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let's move on. we just went through a presidential election. I think everybody realizes that, unless you were asleep or, overseas or somehow detained. Now that Joe Biden is projected as the winner, what signal does this send to the police reform movement? Is this encouraging? And what realistically can you expect a president to do in this arena? Anyone want to jump in there?
Well, I'll take that. I'm excited for newness, of freshness. I think there was some miscommunication, misunderstanding as far as law enforcement in the world we live in. And that's just to even address the ills of society, such things as systemic racism and social injustices. And of course, that was not recognized with the current administration. So I'm hopeful that we learn lessons from those past experiences, and that, the new administration is open and to understand that we have to acknowledge a problem before we resolve a problem.
Good.
I would add to that, I absolutely agree with everything that President Williams just said. And I would add that to have a former prosecutor as Vice President of the United States, someone who has had to consider law enforcement and policing from the perspective of both the victim and police, members of law enforcement, that type of insight and knowledge, I believe, is going to be invaluable. She has seen the effect that crime has on a community. She's also seen the effect that unconstitutional policing has on a community, and she's had the opportunity to consider those things from both the perspective of a prosecutor, a state attorney general, and as a senator. So that type of insight, I think, is going to go far to the police reform and criminal justice reform movement. She's Vice President-elect Harris is someone who's shown an ability to innovate. When she gets new information, she adjusts accordingly because she wants the best solutions possible. And I also believe the same for President-elect Biden. He's someone who's had a good relationship with police. And unlike the current administration, he's not interested in simply telling police agencies and police unions what they want to hear. He is generally concerned about improving policing and making the job of police more efficient, making them better able to serve their communities so that they're more successful in investigating crimes and closing out cases. That's a very different perspective than the current administration, which claims to be a friend of police, but is doing and has done irreparable harm to the ability of police agencies to serve their communities, to solve crimes, and to actually improve public safety.
For me, I think that the things that come immediately to mind, with this administration, I'm probably one of way to the left of many folks on this. And so what I immediately think about, I don't think that he's looking at the types of policies and changes that we, Movement for Black Lives, official Black Lives Matter chapter, are really looking to push. But I think that there's definitely more flexibility or more ability to get those things through. To me, one of the things that he could do immediately, though, is stop funding for projects like Operation Legend, the federal funding that allows for this flooding our police officers with more surveillance gear, and stop the militarization of police. I think that is important. I don't think that our police officers that are serving our communities should be serving our communities decked out like they're going to war. And so I think that those are two things that I think could be immediate. And I think depending on who he chooses, Attorney General, we can get back to some of the things that had started on the Obama administrations to address some of the equity issues, some of the issues we saw in the bias against policing, the way we saw, for instance, in Memphis, we saw that after investigation that there was disproportionate contact from minority youth here, and they were on board with like holding our juvenile court system accountable for that. And then Trump came in, and our current Democratic mayor got rid of that, right? Like dispersed them. So I think seeing somebody being willing to bring that back and continue those investigations and holding folks accountable to what we know has been a consistent level of bias again, militarization. And I think also intervention in the unlawful surveillance of folks offering government dissent. And so under Trump, we know that we saw they brought back being able to, the Black identity extremist designation has changed names a couple of times, but has been used to weaponize and illegally surveil activists who have just been voicing their discontent. We see that happened here in Memphis, and we know that had been happening both at the federal and local level. And I'm hoping that there can be some intervention and immediate change around that as well.
Thank you. That you mentioned Operation Legend. That program is quite controversial. As we all know, the Trump administration brought them to Memphis, and they brought 40 federal agents along with it. This is one thing I'd like to ask you all, whoever wants to weigh in on it. When is it a program like this effective? Can it be effective? We hear a lot about the militarization of police, but on the other hand, the federal agents and the police say they welcome the support to help deal with violent crime. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So even again, as we are on the battlefield for better law enforcement and to safeguard the very communities that we raised our hand to protect and serve, it has to be a collaborative and a memorandum understanding that even when we have these assets in place, they come in as guardians, not as occupying forces like the panelist says, that they come in, militarized, and then that's already a defense for the very communities that they serve. So you have to be transparent. There has to be accountability, but you have to communicate with the very people that you're serving so that they can understand your goals and your initiative, and it's not us versus you. And so again, there has to be transparency and full accountability when we do use these assets, and to understand why it's coming across as occupying versus that we are the guardians of our communities.
I wanted to say that I think that, to me, one of the things that we've seen over and over and over again is that while there has been some correlation, there has not been a direct tie or causation to the number of officers. And so I think for us to continue to keep thinking that pouring money and resources into bringing additional officers versus talking about what actually is the measure, what actually is effective, what are the most effective ways to utilize what we already have, to me is just, if I work at a job and new money comes in and I get a raise and I benefit for it, of course I'm going to be excited about it. That doesn't mean that actually helps me do my job better. That doesn't mean that actually is a benefit to the community or the services that I offer. And I think that there's a mismatch, or there's a lack of being able to actually measure that impact in the communities, right? And so I think that we should start thinking more deeply about some of the tropes that have become so commonplace, but actually are not supported by, if we're talking about data-driven policing, this is one of those points that's actually not fully supported by data. And so it doesn't make sense to flood that amount of money and weapons into situations that have not proven that would be effective, and have no clear-cut plan to make it effective.
Ms. Jones makes a really good point. There might be a limited number of circumstances where that type of surge policing short-term might address a short-term problem. But if the goal is bringing down long-term crime, I think everyone should be clear that crime is not a reflection of people simply possessing some type of inherent criminality. And I think that's what programs like Operation Legend suggest. They fail to actually consider the source and genesis of crime or criminal activity in a given community. So if the problem is related to unemployment or lack of infrastructure, then bringing in extra police forces is not going to address the problem. You'll arrest a lot of people, but the problem will continue because you fail to address the actual issue in the community. And the idea that policing is a response, is the only response to crime in a given community it's a false concept. And it is a mistake that we have made going all the way back to Lyndon Johnson. It's something that we continue doing over and over. Police are not social workers. Police officers are not mental health practitioners. Police officers are not community development specialists. And we should not be asking police officers to fill these roles or to act in lieu of filling these roles because we don't want to spend the money that we need to spend to actually address the issues that cause crime. Police shouldn't be used as a shortcut to simply creating order at the expense of actually improving our communities and solving the problems that result in crime and criminal activity.
Thank you. Sergeant McKinney, could you weigh in on this? I'd like to hear a police perspective on this.
Well, you have to understand the goal of the operation. They didn't come in to answer local calls for service. They were here to assist with dealing with the most violent offenders that we have here in Shelby County. So knowing part of the operation, it wasn't just to come out and police everyday citizens with local calls for service. We're talking about they were dealing with the most violent offenders that we have here, and not just, answering calls for mental crisis, people in mental crisis, or traffic violations, or noise ordinance. So knowing and understanding that with MPD and the county and the crime rate that we currently have going on in the county and the city, they were here to assist in dealing with the most violent offenders that we have here on the streets in order to keep everyone safe.
Have they been helpful in your perspective?
They have been helpful. Everything hasn't been transparent as far as the stats or the numbers of the violent felons that have been captured.
Okay. Well, in a similar vein, I'd like to ask the panel about a concept, a term we hear a lot about today, over-policing. I think many people don't understand this. There's a real disconnect in the communication of that. And as a journalist, I can tell you that I see over-policing a lot when you look through reports and you find police saturation going into communities, and they're making a lot of these low-level arrests of marijuana and dice games and whatnot. And it seems almost like it's a numbers game where they're out there just trying to rack up the score. Tell us about, so whoever wants to take this on, what is over-policing and what can be done about it?
Communities of color are over-policed and underserved. And this goes back to the idea that we need to focus on policing and the conduct of policing as a reflection of our political decisions. Going back to Reconstruction, the end of slavery, it has always been that behaviors that are stereotypically associated with people of color are the types of behaviors that are most likely to be deemed as criminal. And they are also the types of behaviors where policing organizations have been most likely to focus their attention. As a result, police spend more time in communities of color. And it does not add up that if police are spending more time in communities of color, that there is still more crime in communities of color. The problem is that the focus is not on public safety often. The focus is on controlling behavior and making sure that the people who have access and power are comfortable in the communities where they live, and that they don't see certain behaviors that they find to be unsavory. That is how you have situations where certain crimes that people commit regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of nationality, police go to certain communities looking for that crime, even though those communities are not more likely to commit that crime. And until we start to focus on policing as a political process, and until members of the public become more engaged, and that's part of the work that we do at Alliance for Justice, making sure that people understand and participate in the administration of law and the administration of justice, that people are engaged in determining the type of justice system that is operating in their communities and nationally. Until we start to do that and understand that in a constitutional democracy, which we are, the power of the police comes from the people. So until the people learn to engage the levers of power and exercise the control that they have, you will have situations where people who are who in most need of service are finding themselves most oppressed by policing practices.
I wanted to weigh in on that one and just say that I think for me, over policing things is both about the way I think Myesha just said about the types of crimes and the overpresence, but I also think about it in the direct impact. I think about the fact that it means that our children grow up with policing in their school, at their community centers, at the hospital, right? Like there's literally not there's not a place where folks go inside of communities, inner city communities, poverty-ridden communities, where police are not a product, right? Or where police are not directly tied to any of the services that you receive, any of the things that you deal with. And I think it goes to the point of their ability in that community to choose what to enact. And I say that because the officer that was Mr. McKinney was speaking earlier, and I don't believe that it's done maliciously, but there's a way that we throw violent crime out as a scare tactic and a dog whistle, right? And so Memphis has between 650,000, 670,000 if you include Shelby County. So 1% of folks will be 6,700 people. We don't have 6,700 murders in Memphis. We don't have 6,700 violent crimes. And so the majority of policing is not servicing those crimes. Majority of policing is not dealing with those investigations. And there's even further research that says that of the violent crimes, there's only a even smaller percentage of the population that commits those crimes. So like, I can't remember, but the Cure Violence model says something like 90% of the gun violence is presented by, is done by like 8% of the population, right? So saying that bringing in 40 more law enforcement officers, or saying that we need 4,000 more officers to address a problem that in scope, right, is smaller than what we're actually filling our jails with. And so I think that too is the way that we try to make a way for, but it is not like that is what the majority of policing are spending their time on. And so what they are spending their time on is what leads to over policing. It is the criminalization of things like poverty. It is panhandling. It is drug offenses, petty drug offenses. It is so many of these things that can be weaponized, like trespassing, like what is conduct, where you're in disorderly conduct, those type of things. They have a very vague type of definition. It can be really wielded at the discretion of the officer, and we see that them using it over and over again without discretion and without any accountability to it. And to the point that Myesha is making about people pushing back against police, I haven't really seen people attempting to reform police by going directly to police officers. I think what is happening is that there is a deficit of ways that you can actually hold police accountable, right? So there's not a community review board that can hold them accountable. There's no outside policing. You can put pressure on the mayor, you can put pressure on but there's really nothing other than the consistent presence, vocal presence of protest that even makes us look deeply at these issues now. And so I think that's what we're seeing. And it is in part because those mechanisms don't exist to actually push forth accountability and hold officers accountable.
If I can just piggyback on both things, the things that both panelists have said before me, it's all true. Even Noble, when we were founded in 1976 to serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action, because we realized that policing in our Black and brown communities, it was not equal to other communities. And so one of the things, even as I stand as national president, everything they said, you have to have accountability. And let's start with legislation. We have to put standards for use of force, and then there's consequences when officers don't do that. Of course, people fear what they don't understand. And you have to, even if an officer is not from that community, they have an obligation to learn the culture of that community and not judge a person because of their social or their, educational. And so again, that's why we have an over-reliance, because they don't understand and they're fearful. And you can't, like Myesha, Shahidah said, that you cannot control, people's actions. People have liberties, but you got to give them the freedom to exercise in their communities without, being fearful of the police. And that's why it's so bad we don't have that accountability, because when they do see police, it's in an adversarial manner. It's not on a regular manner. And that's why in community policing, you have to be an extension of the community. When you take those uniforms off, that you are still those people in the grocery store, your church members, that they see that law enforcement are a face of humanistic, value. And there has to be accountability. And the only way we can get that accountability is by putting that into legislation and making it law. So there will be accountability.
Very good. Well, I'd like to do a few directed questions here. Sergeant McKinney, starting with you, to what extent do law enforcement officers receive, or the sheriff's office, from what your experience is, receive ongoing evaluations for fitness of duty? Is this, and regarding a number of things like training, policies and procedures, emotional and mental health, what's the protocol for that?
Well, we have in-service training every year where officers go in and get 40 hours of training from all different realms of the department. One thing we do lack is a physical assessment within the department. We have an assessment that we have to seek an outside source through our health insurance, and that is done annually.
I see. So defunding the police, this is another term we hear a lot, and another one that I think is often misunderstood. Of course, there's a wide interpretation of what people want to do with defunding the police, but Lynda, I don't know if you can speak to this. What does defunding the police mean to you?
Absolutely. If you ask one of my college students, they'll say, do away with the police. But if you ask law enforcement executives, as myself, defunding is pardoning and reallocation of funds, because there is an over-reliance of law enforcement, that we're called to do everything. As the scenario states, there's times that there are other professionals that need to be called in on that scene. So defunding is not doing away with the police, it's reallocating funds or appropriating additional funds, because and you have to make sure when you take this away from law enforcement and you put it on to other organizations, that they're able to absorb that, because it's heavy when you just throw something over and you haven't prepared those organizations. So it has to be a continuous partnership that we can balance each other, that when those calls are not law enforcement oriented, but it still takes law enforcement to control that, it takes that partnership. So defunding is just that, reallocating funds or appropriating additional funds for the social services that we deal with in our communities.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'd like to. I know that when we, as the Movement for Black Lives talks about it, we are talking about it as a tactic that is specifically aimed at reducing the size, the budgets, and the power of policing. And it is ultimately a step that we'd like to see taken towards the abolishment of policing in prison, so that we can find alternatives, non-punitive measures, more restorative measures. But as it stands, those are the three major things, is that it's about reducing the size and scope and power of policing as it stands currently.
Good. Well, Shahidah, I'd like to follow up with a question for you and anyone else who wants to jump in on this. But, of course, last summer, critics said that Mayor Strickland had handpicked certain activists that he would, for his sit-down listening campaign.
Mm-hmm. He did, but okay.
Some people wondered, was he listening to the right people? And I'm wondering for you, Shahidah, to the extent, have Black Lives Matter activists who really got this ball rolling several years ago, have they been listened to enough on this issue now?
So, this brings me to correct the thing. I'm not a founder. It was actually founded by Breonna Perry and a couple of other folks. I came on later, but I'm part of the coordinating committee, which is one of our leadership bodies. I do want to check that. But no, he hasn't listened to us on this. And I think one of the things that has been the most frustrating is that when we were part after the bridge shut down, we all met with him. We gave him ideas and suggestions. We talked about community policing models. We've since evolved in, and part of our push down zero tolerance push around is because he literally did not take advantage of that. So it's almost a slap in the face for now for us to be talking about reimagining policing, which was a conversation we were having. Because I'm not sure if y'all recognize, it's also something that was moving under the Obama administration, right? The reimagining policing. So this is not new. And so when we were meeting with him after the bridge and talking about the types of changes we wanted to see, the type of partnerships we wanted to see, the types of things we thought our community could do, he had the opportunity in those first 4 years to do it, to act on it, to partner with us, and he chose not to. And so this go around, he specifically chose activists that weren't part of the original conversation because it's an attempt to start the conversation over versus readdressing the demands that we'd already made. And that's a common and age-old tactic. The task force is an age-old tactic because it's the same conversation. These are the same conversations. You look at the community town halls that were had after the bridge, you'll hear the same things, and literally nothing was done. And now we're in a situation to start that process over again. And that will be what I ultimately feel will be the excuse for why nothing gets done before he's termed out. And so, yeah, I have zero respect for that. And I think that that's an intentional way to avoid accountability, because instead of addressing that, he is still talking about we need more police. He is still talking about broken windows policing. He is still talking about criminalization, tough on crime antics, and all of the things that we're now saying, hey, we need to look at this differently. Like, that is still his trajectory.
Right. And I think he said what he's amplified on that, he believes he has a mandate to do that because he won the election. But does anyone else care to weigh in on this? Is the mayor listening to the right people?
I'm not from Memphis, so I don't know if the mayor is listening to the right people, but I would want to take a moment to highlight the fact that this is a form of accountability. We often think of accountability in terms of holding individual police officers responsible for their acts of behavior, or even holding a police department responsible for its policies and procedures. But the fact of the matter is, your police chief is probably appointed by a mayor, and what that police chief and his body is focusing on is directly influenced by the mayor and the city council. If the policing agency in your community is not responsive to the needs of the community because the mayor is not engaging with the right people, or the city council is not paying attention to what you say your desires for your budget in your community is, then your way of holding police accountable is by holding that elected official accountable, by holding that sheriff accountable. You hold your city council members accountable for what pieces of legislation they are bringing that make certain activity criminal. You hold those elected officials accountable for the budgets that they are implementing, and you hold them accountable. If you have said your district attorney or your state attorney general, I'll use the example of not a Tennessee example, we'll use a Kentucky example with what happened with Breonna in Kentucky. That state attorney general seemed to be very focused on not bringing a prosecution because he'd made some determinations about policing and how it should happen. He completely ignored that as chief law enforcement agent in his community, that his responsibility is to create policing in the manner that his community wants respected, and to set examples and standards for policing. And when police officers fail to meet those examples and fail to meet those standards, it is his responsibility to hold police accountable through prosecutions. If he was not willing to do that, that is a signal to the people who are his constituents, who are voters, that they need to hold him and the police accountable with the way they cast their ballots. So there are a number of ways to create accountability for police and the way that policing happens in your community. And we all need to do a better job of educating the public concerning what those levers of accountability are, how to activate and engage them and keep pressure applied to them long term. It's not something that you can do today and then stop in a year. And I think that's probably what you're seeing from Ms. Jones's organization on the ground. You have to combine your activism and advocacy and protesting with being at every city council meeting, reading every piece of legislation, reading where the budget is being allocated, and holding people's feet to the fire and voting them out if they are not doing what you demand, if they are not giving you the type of policing that you want to see in your community.
Very good, thank you. So let's move to some Facebook questions here. We have a question that I'll just read it. My question for the panel is, what can be done in order to prevent officers with infractions against the public from just being transferred to a different precinct or department? Is there a national database that houses these individuals and their actions that we can join so that these individuals are not kept on the force? I think there's quite a bit of work going on that right now, but does anyone want to take a stab at this?
One part of the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 calls for just that there should be a database of egregious behavior and a pattern by law enforcement officers, that they are, it's just like a resume with any one of us, that when we go somewhere, it's an accountability of what kind of employee and what kind of law enforcement person we were. So if we keep this database and making it a national standard, then absolutely we can control some of that sliding from one department to another, especially when there's a pattern of unconstitutional behavior against the very communities that we serve.
I want to say that
until there is a national database, speaking again about levers of power, every state has a POST, Police Officer Standards and Training. That's the body that's responsible for licensing police officers. The members of POST are usually appointed by the governor. It's different in every state. So being aware of who sits on your state's POST, what they are doing in terms of tracking officers as they move from place to place, insisting that there is some type of mechanism in your community for reporting to POST when a police officer has been found to have engaged in activity. Maybe advocating to your governor and the people that are appointing, that when they make these appointments to your post, Police Officer Standards and Training, that they are appointing people who are engaged and committed to improving policing and making sure that policing is a reflection of the community that individual agencies serve. That's another very important lever that people need to understand how to engage and apply pressure to.
Right. I think that's a good point. And just to hop on that a second, a lot of people are talking about a national database, but there's nothing stopping local activists or officials from creating their own local databases, right? I mean,
I think that I'm trying to look it up because I don't know it by heart, but I know that Commissioner Sawyer recently proposed an ordinance that at the Shelby County level that talked about being able to hold folks and put them in, ask them to both the local and the national database if they were used for excessive force. And so one of the things that we saw was that, often we have conversations like this and it seems like we're all in agreement about that, but then with the actual force and participation is different when it's come time to bring the legislation. I also want to push back just a little bit on the fact that so the mayor gets in office and the mayor and the elected officials get in office, but at the point they are representative of all of us, whether we push for them or not. And so there has to be also another accountability level for the time that they are in office, that we don't have to wait to the next election. And so that means, again, I think we saw that with Trump, right? So we could wait to the next election, but he's already stacked the deck in several areas, right? The long-term effects of the judicial folks that he put in place, the types of things that might, the Affordable Care Act is up in the Supreme Court now. There are several things that might pass before he's gone that we might not be able to change. And similar things happen while they're in office at the state and local level. And so I think that it is important for us to also hold them accountable, but there does also need to be some way to hold them accountable while they are in office to the demands and the things that they say when they run. And so many of them run on platforms, progressive platforms. Many of them run saying that they're willing to think about alternatives and then get in office and do the opposite. And so I think there has to be something in the middle, and there has to be, and it's also, more than just showing up at the county level, because community is more than just showing up at that. And so I think that there's a way that we can do both. And I think that there's a way that we should be able to, for instance, as Commissioner Sawyer is who's also attempted to pass some defund measures. We've seen Michael, and these are folks that did come into the office for community, that were voted in by folks who brought a progressive wave, and then have basically been shut out because they are the odd man in a system, right? Like, so social change is not, it's popular in certain pockets, but generally folks are pushing for a status quo, which is why we see so many folks that have voted for Trump. So there has to be an interim there on how we can handle that as well.
Very good, thank you. I'd like to move to some more of these Facebook questions, because we've got some good questions. This one seems like almost several pages long, but I'm just going to take a sliver of it. And I think it's a good question. So we have body cameras for officers, right? For transparency, and it's changed policing totally. But there's this question. So if they're talking about, I guess, the legend officers, but if these federal officers are exempt from wearing body cameras, where is the transparency? And that's a good point. I'd like to get some elaboration on that, because we see so many of these law enforcement agencies working together, like the multi-gang unit. And so you've got the police, the sheriff's office, the feds, DEA, sometimes FBI, whatnot. And we've seen it like in the Brandon Weber shooting, for example, no body cameras. And so you're kind of left with the old school interpretation of what happened, witness statements, and people tend to shade those in whatever their interest is. But so, anyone want to take a stab on this? Do we need body cameras for the federal agents who are involved here? And how do you go about bringing that change?
This is one of the problems with having federal officers conducting what is essentially local policing functions. And this is a question or an issue that the members of the Memphis community need to hold their leadership responsible for. You brought in these federal agents who are not subject to our local community's norms. And as Ms. Jones said, the role that they are playing here may or may not actually be achieving a long-term goal of lowering violent crime. What is the cost benefit of having these officers in our community when we cannot hold them accountable? You cannot force federal officers, the city of Memphis cannot force them to apply to the local mores. And when a local agency invites in the federal government, they are doing so with the understanding that they have no ability to control that operation. And you have to hold people accountable for that. And someone should have to answer for how the community was either helped or harmed by inviting this federal presence in.
And I'm going to echo just what Myesha said. Exactly. I know we beat the word, but it's the one thing that's missing. It's accountability. When you get resources outside of your jurisdiction, it's just like inviting someone to your house. They have to go by your house rules. And even if the city is requesting assistance, there has to be an oversight. That chief of police or that director is still chief of police when those feds leave their city. So there should be accountability and a memorandum of understanding of what you can and cannot do, because even when that incident is over, that chief and those police officers still have to, guard their communities. And then if you've allowed someone to come in to violate those very rights of the citizens in that community, how do you develop a rapport and respect when they see that you have allowed that to happen. So there are times, and having been a retired Fed, there are times that federal resources are needed, but it's only when there's an accountability and there's a memorandum of what's required and what you can do. And so you have to have that established before you allow someone to come in.
And I guess that's my point, is the thing is that the conversation to me seems to go back to like, we have to hold them accountable, but literally there are no mechanisms for that in place. And so what then? And so I say that not to say that I'm giving up hope, but also to paint the picture of why people take to the streets, of why protest is being used, why social media call outs and things like that are used, because there actually exists no structure to push for accountability any other way. So the demands that people are making is, and that's why part of the demand for defunding the police is to increase the power, right? Because as it stands now, there is no way to intercept that power once it starts. They did not have to get community permission to do that, right? And again, even when it comes to body cameras, and if you go way back to 2015 with the murder of Darius Stewart, and there was a demand for body camera, that demand for body cameras also came with a list that we asked for, which included transparency, which included officers being penalized or let go for turning their body cameras off. And then we see 3 years later with Martavius Banks that the officers willfully and knowingly turned their body cameras off before they went in and shot them 22 times, or I think that was 13 times. It was 22 with Brandon Weber. And so we see that, and then there's literally no space for us to push back other than to take the streets. And so then we're then penalized, or the narrative is, oh, all they want is protest. All they want is this, when the reality is what we want is the mechanisms and ability to have power and say in our communities about how our communities are treated, who is policing, how they're policing, and when. And there should be that, because every panel, everywhere we sit, police officers agree that there should be some community there. But when we get into the opportunities to talk about actually enacting, we have a citizens review board here, but before it passed, they took the subpoena power from them. So it has no actual ability to hold accountability. And so those are the types of things that have to be put in place and supported to do that.
Thank you. Here's a related question from someone on Facebook who's an audience, from the audience. What is the protocol for addressing the misbehavior of police officers that may not have recorded video? And I can just say, anecdotally, that I've seen a lot of these disciplinary actions in MPD, and it tends to be a suspension of whatever, a few days generally, as a violation of department regulation. But I guess Sergeant McKinney, what is the protocol over there at the Shelby County Sheriff's Office, and is it enough when officers intentionally or accidentally don't record incidents?
Anytime that occurs, that incident is reviewed by the Bureau of Professionals and Standards. And once they complete their investigation and it is determined that there was a policy violation, then that officer is dealt with accordingly, whether it be from the line level, whether it's major discipline or minor discipline. But there is a policy in place to address that. Okay.
We have probably time for one more question. Reader asks, an audience member asks, what do you think about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? Does anyone want to take a stab at this? Tell us really quickly what that's about.
I think that, and even Noble has built legislation off the tentacles of the Policing Act of 2020. It is a blueprint, but it's only as good as it's put in place. And so until we hold that accountability and that transparency, it's one thing, just like how Ms. Jones and everyone else saying, protests are just that, and they have a right to protest when they think they're not being heard. But it has to be the accountability from the top down. And so even with review boards, even with disciplinary action, you have to communicate that, because even as you're going through the process, the citizens have a right to know what's going on. That's how you build respect, that you recognize that there's a hurt and an injustice, and you recognize that. So we're hopeful that if we don't come home with all of it, that some of it will come into play, because the world, America, is tired of the same old, same old. And I do believe that this is more than just a moment, but a movement, because it permeates across every line, through racial lines and social lines, and even into corporate America in the sports arena. A change has to come, because when you can continually see the brutality in living color on TV, it makes a difference. So can you imagine when we didn't have cameras? So again, we have to have that accountability, and it starts at the top. It starts with educating ourselves with those people that are running for office, that you know their platform, you know their background, you know their scorecard, to be careful of the very persons that we put in office, because only until that is recognized at the top and works its way down to the bottom, then the change will be slow.